One, I am excited to talk about this particular film and reading. Honestly, I was still recovering from being sick and had a hard time getting through the movie in one sitting. It took me 4 days, not because it was boring, but because with all of the long silent stretches, it was very easy to close my eyes, and I ended up realizing that I hadn't opened them again when the speaking started, so I had no idea what they were saying. So there was a lot of me having to go back and start sections over again. I thought that the film was a good companion piece for Outline because both of the main characters seemed to be receptacles for other people's stories, and it reminded me of the reading by, I think it was Jackson, on Muteness. We've talked a lot already about Outline, but there was one point I wanted to bring up, and that was when the main character was having lunch with her colleagues. Ryan was discussing going out and having parties with the students and learning Greek translations, and he specifically mentions that he learned the translation of the word ellipsis. And ellipsis are the three dots that you put at the end of a sentence when you want to continue it or when there's more to say but you don't want to say it. And he means that it is directly translated as to hide behind silence, which is what is happening throughout both films, both the film and the book, as the main characters are hiding behind silence. To continue with the word ellipsis, the root of it is ellipse, which is an oval, and it's a mathematical term defined by the elliptical outline that connects the points that are moving within the oval. And I'll post a diagram because I don't think I've explained it very well. But it basically is the outline of the movement within. So here the author is explained the entire format of her book with this innocuous little conversation with Ryan about about partying with the student. So the author has explained the format of the book, that the narrator's identity is being outlined to us through the movements, through her movements and interactions with these different characters, each of them a point within the elliptical, or within the ellipsis, or When it comes to the Rendezvous of Anna, I'm kind of going to talk about specific points in it that were really intriguing to me. First, I just want to mention the cinematography, the interesting use of the static point of view of the camera that never moves and is almost always centered on the action being right in the middle of it. It's a very passive view for the viewer to be stuck in one place and not be participating in the movement at all. And I thought that was a very interesting choice. It added to the sense of silence, as did Anna's tendency to walk into a room and stop as though she was evaluating the body of the room and its potential for framing in her own sense of directing. But there are 4 points in the film that I really wanted to talk about where Anna actually reveals something about herself to us, and that would be first when she has asked the man she's brought home to leave, and he is saying, you know, you meet a woman and I tell myself something wonderful is going to happen, and then she tells me to get dressed. And life is that just the way life is? And she says, don't say things like that, because sometimes I do bring somebody home. And then she says, and I let it happen, but I don't think I tell myself anything. And the fact that she just is a passive participant, almost not a participant, she's just a passive entity in what happens, feels like a summation of how she feels her life is going at this point, where things are just happening and she's just allowing it without any reflection whatsoever. In the film, as she meets people, she ends up being sort of the receptacle for all of their sad stories, their stories of victimhood, which most tend to seem to have the manipulative purpose of guilt tripping her. Like when she talks with the mother-in-law, or the mother of her ex-fiance, who is trying to convince her that she should come back to her son. Then as her mom talks about what's going on with her father, and of course the man from the beginning who tries to say, you know, what I'd already talked about with, hey, you think something wonderful is going to happen, and then they tell you to get dressed. Everybody seems to be expressing these feelings of victimhood at her actions, or her lack of actions in some cases. But the only time she seems to reveal anything about herself is when she's lying with her mother. And I love this scene because she's lying there in the dark, naked, next to her mom, who is partially clothed. And she begins to talk about her lesbian experience and the initial confusion, and the happiness that it has brought to her, and it being the only time with this other woman that she seems to spend time talking with somebody as opposed to listening to somebody. And it's also telling that she spends so much of the movie trying to reconnect with this woman and not finding her. It seems to me that this woman represents Anna's own voice, something that she's only found for a brief moment and keeps trying to find again, but with everything going on around her, can't connect with it, and doesn't take the time to fully search for it. And then her voice seems to be searching back for her, which I'll talk about later. And it's interesting that her mother's first response is, I wouldn't dare tell your father. And then Anna asks her, have you ever loved a woman And her mother responds by saying, I don't know. I've never really thought about it. For me, the hidden conversation is, Mom, have you ever found your own voice? And her mother saying, no, and I've never really thought to try. She's just allowed herself to be moved around by whatever cultural expectations were placed upon her. I think this was very important conversation hidden within this scene. And the third point, and this is probably, I think, the thing that sums up the entire movie, or at least in my opinion, sums up what Anna is truly looking for, ironically comes from the sob story of her lover, who is lamenting how people are constantly after him and how much easier it would be if he were a woman, because he could just get pregnant and spend his time breastfeeding, because we all know it's about more than food. And the idea that, for him, the idea that to be a woman means that there's no mental anguish, no demands placed upon you, that life is just easy and full of nothing but breasts and babies, is hilarious to me. And he says, what's lovelier than a woman's voice? Where does a woman's voice come from? And it's almost this bizarre form of mocking, as he's telling his story of victimhood and then idealizing the idea of being a woman, and but at the same time he's pointing out directly that a woman's voice is the what's lovelier than a woman's voice. What could be more powerful? The one thing that Anna doesn't seem to have. And then he says, and where does it come from? The question that Anna is trying to figure out, where will her voice come from? And it's this very uncomfortable set of questions coming in this uncomfortable situation. And her reaction to it is interesting to me, because right afterwards he says, will you sing for me? He's looking to hear her voice, but he's looking to hear this idealized, simple, uncomplicated voice. And she's trying to find this powerful inner voice. And so she says, well, I sing off key. And he kind of calls her on her bullshit and says, you said you always wanted to be a singer. And she says, well, what? And she sings, now she's expressing that it's a career, but she still is unfulfilled. So it's kind of that dichotomy of a woman not being able to fulfill the expectations of being a housewife and thinking that they'll have fulfillment if they choose the career and still not being able to know who they really are. And I think that's a sad commentary that things that we've discussed before about feeling like women are expected to be one thing or another thing, either be female or be male, and they're so for me this was kind of another one of the very few points in the movie where she is relating something about herself, but it's hidden within this song. And it's after this that she starts to sort of unravel. And it's beautiful the way the film shows that unraveling for me as she's sitting in the back of the taxi and you can hear the counting of the meter, and it's this very quick repetitive t-t-t, 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 and the movement of the cars is faster than it's been, and you can see that she starts crying, and as the slow pace of everything else, this is such a contrast in this scene where she's really beginning to understand that she doesn't seem to be capable of making these connections. And then finally, the scene in the very end where she's listening to her messages. This is another example of her not having a voice because the voices on the answering machine are speaking for her, especially that final voice where the woman says, "Anna, where are you?" is the final question that she's asking herself. Anyway, I really enjoyed both the book and the film, and I'm excited to be able to talk with you guys about it, and I'm excited to hear Regina's take